My name is Sean Murphy. I'm going to be acting as the voice of the audience for a briefing by Mike Keer on the current slate of global supply chains. Mike Keer is the founder and managing partner of the Product Realization Group. He has over 30 years of experience bringing high-tech electronic products to market. The Product Realization Group guides the world's most innovative companies to accelerate the delivery of their products from concept to full market scale. They do this with a team of seasoned experts, some of whom are on the panel tonight, with proven methodologies and trusted partners. Their clients include clean technology, medical device, industrial, consumer electronics, and high technology startups, SMBs, and large companies. Mike?
Thank you, Sean, and thank you all for attending. I see several names that I don't see faces, but I see several names that I recognize from past lives. So let me get that going there. And Sean already mentioned what we do, so I'll skip over this slide. I will also mention that about a year and a half ago, we made a pivot to mission-driven activities, and we're focusing a little bit more heavily on clean tech and medical device in terms of the focus of the business right now. Okay, so supply chain has been a real issue since COVID-19. A lot of things have gotten worse. So the intent of the presentation really is to talk about how did we get here? What's the current state? What are some ways that you can mitigate? And then where are things looking forward? And then have enough time for a good amount of Q&A. So I figured about half the time for presentation, about half the time for Q&A. So with that, what has the impact of COVID-19 been? Increasing lead times and costs to get electronic components, shortages of raw material, scarcity of skilled labor, and issues with transportation and logistics. So there's many others, but those are, I would say, the big hitters from what we see in my business. And this is an example, a chart from Levitt Data, where you can see the lead times of components are going from 12 weeks all the way to 39, and I've heard these days they can be up to 52 weeks plus lead time. So it may vary depending on the part, it may vary depending on the industry, but the story here is that part lead times are going out dramatically, and if you don't have an ability to manage that, if you don't have a handle on that, it's going to have a real impact on your ability to ship product. Okay, the other issue that feeds into these part shortages is raw material issues with raw materials. I picked on copper. This is by no means the only material. Think about wood for homes. The price of wood went up substantially. You couldn't get it. I just ordered windows for my house, and I ordered them in March, and they got here in September. That normally would be a 4 to 6 week lead time. So part shortages and raw material shortages are a big issue. The other dynamic with raw materials is I would say instability, uncertainty. So just recently, China had a hiccup and copper prices are going down. So I think you've got shortages, but also just a lot of uncertainty. And I think some of that uncertainty is due to COVID, and what are the impacts of COVID? How long is it going to last? How fast is it going to go away? And how can people plan? Yeah. Okay, and then the third aspect is labor shortage, and I would put this in two different pieces. One is, I think, something directly related to COVID, where people got laid off. Factories had to run with less people because they had to have distance in between factory workers. People quit. They got COVID. They got ill. But I think there's a bigger underlying trend here as well, especially in the U.S., where it's just harder to get manufacturing labor, and it's overall more difficult to get skilled labor in factories than it was 10 years, 15 years, 20 years ago. And this is a trend that I see continuing beyond beyond COVID. It's some of it short term is COVID, but I think there's also just a larger trend that is beyond COVID that has to do with the dynamics of the labor market and getting harder to get skilled labor. Okay, and then the other big one is transportation and logistics, and you can see from the picture this happens to be Port of Long Beach, and you can see the container ship stacked up there. So this is quite grim. It's not only Long Beach. I mean, this is kind of happening everywhere, and the price of shipping material has gone up dramatically, which is increasing the price of goods and materials, which is impacting inflation. So that's the big hitters. The last one I didn't put on the front slide, but there is overall an increase in demand in some different industries. One is medical. You think about diagnostics, COVID tests, medical technology, remote health. So there's a big advancement in the automation of medical devices, which is increasing the demand for components. The same is true for infrastructure. You think about how many people are working from home. Everybody working from home at some point is going to need data centers to manage that data. So there's a big expansion of computers at home, is also data centers. And then in parallel, there's been this increase in automotive, a migration from traditional engines, which use less electronics, to now electric vehicles, which are mostly all electronics, right? I mean, an EV basically is a computer with a battery, right? I mean, that's a lot more electronics, and then you think, on top of that, LiDAR and other things. So, and then the final big change is 5G, which is this migration from the 4G to 5G technology, which is also increasing demand. So, you think about, on the one side, you've got less components, you've got more challenges with transportation, combined with increasing demand from a variety of different industries. That's just not a good situation. And I've heard people say this is as bad that they've seen the supply chain in their history. Yeah. Okay, so what do you do about it? So I'm going to lay out a few strategies, and again, we can get into more during the Q&A. But if you're an OEM and you're making a product and you're relying on supply chain partners as part of that process, you want to make sure as an OEM that you get involved with all aspects of the supply chain. Just relying on a CM to fix the problem is not enough. You have to be in the weeds. You have to be communicating with distributors. You have to be communicating with your CM. You have to be communicating directly with key component manufacturers and fabrication suppliers. Everybody wants material, especially if you're a smaller outfit and you have less leverage. My experience, and I spent 8 years working in a contract manufacturer, is to some degree the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So if you're squeaking, you're likely going to have a better chance than if you're not. So, understanding what the issues are, and then working direct relationships, trusted relationships, building those key relationships is really critical to to helping you mitigate the risks in some of these component situations. Okay, the other aspect is, if you can't find a part, you're likely going to have to go to a broker buy if you want to ship. And there's a number of risks associated with broker buys. In addition to higher cost, you have to make sure your date codes are lined up. You're not buying expired parts. And the other risk is you don't know where parts are coming from. There could be fake parts, but making sure your parts are tested and verified. If possible, ask for a certificate of compliance to make sure that if you are going through that channel, the parts are going to be good and they're not going to fail when you go into manufacturing. Okay, so those are a few tips on the strategies for managing part shortages. The warning here really is bigger companies. If you go back to 99, 2000, which I lived through, the bigger companies would double and triple book because they didn't want to run out of parts. They wanted to make sure they had material. And at some point, it was a little bit of a bubble. And when that burst, all of a sudden, the whole situation turned the other way. There was a glut of components. So I don't know if and when that will happen, but I do think there's a real likelihood that at some point, maybe it's not this year, maybe it's not 22, maybe it's 2023, maybe it's sometime in 2022. But at some point, if that is happening, there's likely going to be a glut, and things are going to turn rapidly, from a shortage to an overage. Okay, and then the other piece is, how do you manage transportation and logistics? It's costing more money and it's taking more time. So as you plan your production cycle and from manufacturing to dock, you have to make sure you have plan for an increased lead time in those materials to take into account transportation, right? Whether that be a boat or a truck or whatever it's going to be to get the part from the manufacturer all the way to the end customer. Okay, it may take weeks to be able to dock and get offloaded. You saw the pictures I showed earlier. I mean, there's ships that are waiting off in the water that can't get on shore. So even if you have material sitting there, you may not be able to access it until those boats can get on shore and get offloaded. Okay, and it's not just boats in the water, you know, going from Asia here. It's also transportation locally. A lot of truckers have gotten COVID. A lot of truckers quit during COVID. So there's a shortage of drivers right now to transport goods around. So you know, again, all this is, you've just got to spend more time. You got to spend more resources to make sure you know what's happening and you're on top of things. Right, and then that's, I would say, the last two slides were hitting the immediate crisis and what do you do for that. What I'm talking about now is going to be 7 strategies to build to mitigate risk as well as build a more resilient supply chain. So first strategy, understand end user market, location, capabilities, politics, and policies. Okay, that's going to help you understand where you want to manufacture. Do you have in-country content, et cetera? So that's, you know, from a very high strategic level, you want to understand that. The next is when you're designing products, you want to, as much as possible, find and identify short lead time parts in the design process. And then once those parts are designed in, you want to stabilize the product before you really scale into volume. Okay. And you know, doing a change in a local or let's say a regional environment is much more challenging than doing it in a volume scale when you're building product offshore. Okay, and then when you're selecting your suppliers, select them carefully. Are they a good fit for your product? Are they a good fit for your technology, culture? Can they scale to meet your needs? Can they support your costs? Can they support your quality? What's their financial stability? Especially through COVID, a lot of companies have had, you know, challenges with finances. I remember back in the dot-com bubble, a lot of companies just went out of business. So, you know, can they weather a storm if things go the other way? And then what are the right locations? A lot of people have talked about doing more locally. There are new models. One of the models is to bring parts in from offshore and then configure them, do the final assembly locally, and then ship locally. So understanding really the overall picture and selecting the right strategy for your business can go a long way to mitigating risk and developing a resilient supply chain. Where practical, you want to duplicate the sources of supply. So smaller companies, that may not be very easy if you don't have a lot of volume and you don't have a budget. That may not be possible, but certainly as you get into becoming a larger business, having duplicate sources of supply will mitigate risk. And there's a lot of risk out there. It's not just COVID. You've got also now environmental risk. What if there's a flood? What if there's a fire and you're only building at one factory and that factory goes down? That can have a major impact on your business. So communication, very important, especially if you're building outside the US. I would recommend getting a good data management system so you can manage the data, and then having regular people that speak the language. You know, if you have a different language, if you have a language barrier, making sure whoever's communicating is able to speak the language clearly and deal with suppliers overseas. And then think of suppliers as an extension of your business, right? So you want to be talking to them just like you talk to anybody else in your business. You want to have regular supplier reviews at least once a quarter. And again, my experience working in the CM world for a number of years, the best clients were the ones that communicated the most and had feet on the street, you know, kind of coming regularly to the factory, communicating, making sure things were on track. Okay, and when you're looking for manufacturing partners, again, what are some things to look at when you're measuring performance And these are some of the key factors that I've used, and they're, you know, I would say they're good across the industry. You want to look at quality, you want to look at cost, you want to look at delivery, and you want to look at overall process improvement automation. So is your manufacturing partner getting better? Is their quality getting better? Is their cost going down? Is their delivery improving? And that's in the spirit of process improvement. Again, you know, continuous improvement. And you want to have these kind of reviews at a minimum once per quarter. You want to have regular conversations on a much more frequent basis. Okay, and I'll end it with team. People are so important when you're running a company. Most important asset, and these days really, really hard to get good people. So if you have good people, keep them. And when it comes to supply chain, understand what types of resources you need. Do you can you leverage consultants? Do you need to hire full-time? What is the need? What is the skill set? What is the capability? How can you recruit, vet, retain top talent? How do you deal with remote working? I mean, I've seen a lot of people have challenges with manufacturing being done in Malaysia, manufacturing being done in China, Taiwan, and they can't go visit the factory now because in order to go visit, you've got to quarantine for 14 days when you go there, and then you got to quarantine another 14 days when you come back. So it becomes very impractical to just take a quick trip and fly back and forth. It's just not easy to do, at least in the, you know, in the current COVID situation. So how do you deal with that? Can you find resources in country to manage for you? How does remote development impact your development environment? How do you onboard people when you're interviewing remotely and they may be working remotely? How do you maintain team motivation when people aren't on a regular basis working in the same quarters and communicating together? How can you enhance collaboration with a remote workforce? And then how do you manage performance? What do you do if you have somebody that's not performing? So, okay, so I'll end it there, and I'm not sure how we're doing time wise, but I think now is a good time to take a pause on the the content side, and then allow. And if you, by the way, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'll leave my contact information there, and happy to take any email questions after. But for now, let's open it up to audience questions. And I have a couple ringers with me, two people that are on my team that have combined, I don't want to say how many years, but a lot of years of experience. I think each has more than 40 years of experience. So let's just leave it at that. So let's go into the audience questions. Yeah.
Okay, Mike, we've got a couple of questions, and if you're in the audience, please feel free to use the chat to ask your question. We had a kind of an observation / question from Mark Novicki, which was he views COVID as a stress test, and he's comparing it to kind of related issues pre-COVID, where seasonal lead times would take a hit around holidays, etc. COVID's essentially lowered the water and exposed a lot of rocks. And he also mentioned he thought that there was a shortage of containers. Is that a useful metaphor for thinking about what's going on, that it's just an overlay stress test to the normal fluctuations and problems?
Yeah, my personal thinking is that COVID has injected challenges that are a little bit different than just lowering the water. That's my opinion, just from what I see in terms of, for example, not being able to go to a country, having to quarantine 14 days. I know factories that are open have to have their factory workers separated by mask and that kind of thing. So to me, it's not a normal situation that people are adapting to. It's actually changing the overall situation that we're in. So maybe part of it is if things weren't managed well, they got worse faster. But I think there is an element of COVID that is injected new dynamics that we haven't seen before. And I'll turn it over to either Shirish or Alan to add any other thoughts on that.
No, I think Mike, you paraphrased it perfectly. I think this is worse than anything we have ever seen in some ways in the supply chain. And I think it's going to change our behavior, our planning processes, our thought processes for the future. I mean, you see it right now in the labor force, how people are behaving, how companies are behaving, the kind of controls they need to put in place. So I think the landscape has altered for sure. For how long, that remains to be seen.
Yeah, and some of that may depend on how long COVID,
Right.
continues to impact the economy. Yeah. Great.
All right, Alan, anything, or I've got a couple more questions.
Yeah, so I wanted to add to that. I think if you look back over the last 20 or 30 years, there's been other times when we've seen something similar to this. My experience with that, it's always been kind of the fact that the supply and demand equation got mixed up for a little while, and there just wasn't enough capacity to supply the parts that people were trying to get. I think COVID has added much more on top of that situation than before.
I have a question from Kwan. He says, hey, shall we start getting out of China for manufacturing hardware, or should we continue to rely on China for manufacturing?
That is a great question, and thank you, Kite, for that question. I think I'm going to defer. Yeah, I think there are multiple answers depending on the product, but I'll again defer to Shirish and give his expert opinion, because he's been heavily involved directly in this. So.
Yeah, so I think in today's environment, depending on the kind of product that you have, China is still a viable option as long as you understand all the risks associated with it. Clearly there are risks right now with transportation, with getting parts, with logistics, all of that. But beyond that, there is also a risk of higher tariffs on China products. So in a lot of instances that I have seen, people have moved some of their manufacturing processes to other countries where, the situation with the trade tariffs is not as bad. Okay, for example, Malaysia, for example, India. And depending on the kind of product you have, you also need to look at transportation costs and so on. So if your product is a large form factor product where logistics is a major expense, then you want to think of other options, like, for example, domestically or in Mexico, where trucking is an option. So you have to factor in several different angles. It's not just one angle.
So there's a geopolitical overlay in addition to the COVID stress.
For sure.
Yeah, and I don't know if you have any additions on that, or you.
Yeah, I see more and more people are trying to kind of break up the supply chain from the standpoint of getting the components globally, and then but bringing the final assembly and shipping part of it more to a local regions. And there are a lot of people that are asking me the question these days, should I move out of China and do kind of at least the last mile logistics and locally in California or the US?
Yeah, and I would kind of echo what John said, which is I think there's an immediate issue, which is you have COVID, you have tariffs, but I do think there's a broader geopolitical shift that's causing tensions between US, Europe, and China specifically, that I don't see getting better anytime soon. And so I would say the risk is going up. So if there's a way to mitigate that risk and you can do it, I would recommend it. Yeah.
So you stress the need for a good data management system. Are there any that you recommend?
Well, there's a number of them out there. So I don't want to necessarily sell a particular product or other. But what I would say is, depending on the size of business you have, there are packages more suited to very small companies. There are packages a little bit more geared to the SMB, kind of mid-market, and then there are very large systems that are geared for larger companies. So again, that's going to really depend on what is the nature of your business. Are you a startup or a large company? And then you've got to size the product for your business. And again, if you wanted to ping me offline, I'm happy to have that discussion. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to move on then to another question from Jay. Are hardware designers using fewer unique parts to increase the volumes of the fewer parts? So has there been a shift in design strategy, or?
Can you repeat the question? I'm not sure.
I'm sorry, maybe I didn't phrase it very well. So the question was, are hardware designers using fewer unique parts to increase the volumes? So fewer parts, higher volume on those parts, fewer unique parts. Is that a shift that you're seeing now? Question from Jay.
Yeah, again, it really depends on the client. I mean, I've got a number, as we make the shift to clean tech, I would say those kind of parts tend to be more custom. Maybe they're solar panels or big metal parts or battery storage or whatever. So in that case, a lot of the parts are going to be custom because of the nature of the product. Perhaps in IoT products that is, that may be more the case. So again, I would say there's never a one size fits all in these things. It's really going to depend on your product, your business, your volume, and also the maturity of your design team. So, that's my 2 cents. I'll turn over to Shirish and Alan to get their perspectives.
So, I think, again, in any design, doesn't matter what kind of design it is or what kind of product, there are going to be certain amount of parts, especially at the electronics components level in terms of passives, that you could substitute with, like parts. But as you get into more of the specialized silicon, and that can come in multiple, forms, you tend to get restricted in the supply chain partners or the manufacturers who supply those parts. And a lot of times you have to think of also the design footprint, because just because a supplier or a manufacturer provides a part of similar function, it also has to have the same footprint that it can fit onto your design framework, right? Otherwise, you can't interchange parts. So a lot of things come into play. I don't see a major shift, at least in terms of design thinking, in that particular question area.
Alan?
Yeah, I guess maybe I'm lucky in that the hardware teams that I'm working with these days are paying much more attention to availability of parts before they select them into the bill of materials. So I think all of this communication and noise people are hearing about the lack of parts has caused engineering teams to be paying a lot more attention to it, particularly when it comes to microprocessors and ICs and those types of things. They're checking out the availability of the parts before they design them in. This has been something that operations people have been pushing for a lot of years, and I think it's finally getting some attention now. So I'm pleased to see it.
Let me ask a follow-up. It's a slight variant on that. Do you see increasing levels of integration where they might shift to an ASIC or a system on a chip to replace 5 or 10 or 20 parts to simplify the supply chain, or is that equally problematic?
Well, that thinking has been in place for quite some time. For 2 reasons. Number one, people want to minimize the area on a PC board, right? For example, and as products get smaller and smaller, that's become a necessity. But that is, I think, independent of the current crisis that we are in. I mean, that thinking has been around for a few years now, is how do I reduce the footprint? How do I combine more functionality? And as the designers start thinking about that, the manufacturers are coming out with parts that have more functionality built in, system on chip, for instance, and all the other ASICs that are there in the industry. So that I don't think is directly related to COVID in any way.
Okay.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is, I have seen a lot of companies that I work with try and, at least early on, design Raspberry Pis and kind of, I would say off the shelf sort of sub-assemblies. And, there's going to always be a trade-off. First of all, they're going to pay more likely for those. And then if you want to really control a product and have control of a product, you don't have control over Raspberry Pi. You don't have control of standard parts. So if Raspberry Pi decides to go from Rev A to Rev B and your product doesn't work anymore, it's tough luck, right? So so the companies that want more control and have more volume, generally they'll design custom. The companies that are kind of scrappy and starting out, it's not on. It's pretty common for them to use a standard platform. Yeah.
Ellen, anything to add, or I?
No, I think Sharice, captured it very, very well. I think that the strategy to, look at reducing the number of parts going on a board has been around for a long time. I don't think COVID itself has really had an impact on, that design strategy.
I have a question for Carolyn from Carolyn Masters. What have earlier chip shortages been like, and what can we learn from them to improve the current situation?
I mean, my last experience was 99, 2000, where things really went, kind of haywire, and that was not COVID related. That was just, economic boom times where everything was high, it was .com bubble. It was really a bubble, and the large companies over ordered, and they double and triple book parts, and small companies couldn't get parts, and and then it imploded. That's what I experienced. What can we learn from it? I'm not sure, except for, make sure you communicate, a lot of the best practices I shared before, I think those still apply, keep good contact, understand your suppliers, manage directly, build trusted relationships, all those things I think would still apply. But I'll turn it over to Sharish and Alan for their perspective. Yeah.
No, I think you captured that perfectly, Mike. I think I would echo the same sentiment, really.
So we had an observation from Luke Mullen that prior global supply chain stress tests that were regional crises that ripple globally were the Japan earthquake tsunami, the South Korean battery factory fire, the Taiwan earthquake impacting their fabs, the .com crash, which is the one you mentioned, Mike, and then 9/11, which I think is part of the same .com crash. So I think he's adding some color to that.
Yeah. I mean, there have been regional issues that have caused shortages. I mean, there were floods in Thailand where you didn't get any disk drives, so there's those pockets have always existed, and I'm sure in the future will continue to happen, especially with the kind of challenges we are seeing in the climate. But in general, this crisis is, all around. It's a 360-degree crisis right now. It's the perfect storm. And at some point, as Mike mentioned earlier, there'll be a glut in the market. So that's something that I don't know what that is going to bring.
Okay. We have an observation from Jonathan Dillon that what people don't know is that the second source or substitute part may in fact be fabricated, tested, or packaged in the same facility and possibly the same die sole by more than one quote manufacturer. So is that something that PRG helps with, to track true second sources?
Well, not really. I think the observation that Jonathan is making is correct, though it's very hard to identify. Because, I mean, if you look at the foundries that exist in the world, right, there's only one TSMC, right? And there's like 8,000 people looking at TSMC to build product. So I think some of that is going to happen. How we can trace that back, I'm not sure. And is there really a second source strategy to that?
Okay.
Yeah, the addition to that would be, it's a very good observation. So thank you for adding that. Could that part be manufactured in two different factories, and then that would be another way to mitigate the risk, right? Even if it's the same part, that's got different nameplates on it. If they're actually coming from two different physical factories, that could be a way to mitigate the risk. Yeah.
Okay. Jonathan gives an example, the onsemi fab sets for ST. So we have a follow-up question from Carolyn Masters. If we were to seriously consider moving to more manufacturing in the US, what would that look like? How can we really do that? How can we really do this? Not just make noise about it, but actually do it.
Well, some products are already coming back to the U.S. And I think it's a strategic supply chain question that needs to be answered strategically. So it's not a, necessarily a gut check. I mean, we live in a global world, at least at the moment. So I think you've got to make strategies that make sense in the current economy. I don't believe right now, if you brought everything back to the U.S., it could be brought back to the U.S. The U.S. could handle the capacity with the current manufacturing infrastructure we have. That we have a dramatic shift in how we're doing things. So I don't think it's physically possible, at least in the short run. Maybe, China took 20 to 30 years to build up capacity to be able to, get the kind of scale that they have. So I think it's a case by case. A lot of companies that have bigger, more complex products, medical, clean tech, a lot of those at least are assembled here. And, perhaps it's a bifurcated strategy where some of the core components are coming from overseas, and then they're getting assembled in the US, and then they're getting shipped. So that is a trend that I've seen, more recently, where, some raw parts are coming from overseas, but the final assembly test, some of the value add is still being done in the US, and that, kind of puts the best of both worlds. And I'll turn it over to Shirish and Alan.
No, I think Alan has more experience at bringing products back on shore, so I'll defer to him.
Yeah, no, I'm working with a couple of clients right now that are doing exactly what Mike is, indicated, is that they are, globally sourcing the components and even some sub-assemblies, but doing the final assembly, testing, loading the software, and shipping, locally, very close to where their headquarters are, and keeping things kind of, close to the best.
We had a follow-up on that. Are there any government initiatives that are helpful?
Not that I'm directly aware of, but I mean, there's a $3.2 trillion budget bill that's trying to get passed. We'll see what comes out of that. I mean, it's possible that there is going to be money flowing around that. I thought I did read that they were going to be investing in fabs and some core technology as part of that, but I don't know the details of it.
We have a slightly grimmer question, which I think is not at least worth putting to you, which is, what would a conflict with China mean about the manufacturing of these devices?
I think
I don't even want to contemplate that.
Well, we see
would be quite serious. I think
we see almost daily incursions by multiple fighter planes into Taiwanese airspace. You could see where there might be a misunderstanding that escalates, right? In other words, it doesn't have to be, Shanghai becomes the new Hiroshima, but it could be something that a misunderstanding escalates, right?
I mean, Taiwan is a big manufacturer too. So I mean, I think when you talk about that kind of a war, the risk to the global economy gets very high, very fast. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't see a happy outcome coming out of that.
Okay. Question from Jay: are there any serious moves happening from China to Mexico for the small generic passives and smaller parts?
I have not seen much of that.
Either.
No.
Okay.
But however, I have seen a fair amount of larger box build, larger, heavier products go from Asia to Mexico. I quite recently working with a client that shifted their whole assembly from mainland China to Mexico. So that is happening. Not so much at the passive level, but at the higher level, especially when you get into heavier products.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm seeing that at the box build level, not at the component passive level.
Yeah. And I think the other factor to consider is that, most of the time when these decisions happen, logistics, costs, and transportation is a big factor in considering that.
Could you explain a little bit about what you see the forces at work? Jay's hypothesis was it was going to be small components. What you're observing is a more complex box build level. Is it beyond logistics, or is it purely driven by logistics?
No, I think it's in general, transportation and logistics in general is a big issue. Primarily because, a lot of times when you have heavy equipment being transported, it also tends to get damaged, right? That's one of the factors. The other factor is also portion is most of the heavier product. It's easier to truck across the border, right? And delivery, predictability, all of that is much better. So I think those are some of the key areas that people make their decisions on, basically.
Yeah, I
That's
agree with
very
that.
interesting. Well, I'm going to ask the audience if they have any other questions they'd like to put to the panel. Sorry, we have somebody with a hand
He's
raised.
got a hand up there. Yeah.
You want to use the chat and type it in? Question about what about South America?
That's
Oh, as a
As a
supplier.
supplier, as a
Okay.
supplier, have you seen any shift to not just not like Mexico, Central America, but further south?
in the past, I've seen Brazil as a possible alternative, but lately, nobody seems to be talking too much about that. 10 years ago, for sure, Brazil was being talked about, Argentina was being talked about. Right now, the shift I see more happening is towards relocating some of the services functions into places like Costa Rica and so on, which is, tech support, things like that, which are the value add services, if you will. So there is a move to move some of that into South American geographies, but not mainstream manufacturing.
Yeah, I've seen that where there's been several medical device companies that are building product in Costa Rica, and they've built some factories down there to do the kind of box build, portion of it. I don't see a lot of components, passives, and stuff being built in Costa Rica, but there is the box build element that's happening there, particularly for medical devices.
We have a question from Amy. There's been a lot of talk about ESG. Has there been any shift towards greener supply chains?
Not sure how to answer that. Mike or Alan, I'll defer to you for that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say there's a lot of talk about companies wanting to be greener, but I haven't seen major initiatives, at least that I'm aware of, that are substantially changing the way parts are made, recycled, et cetera. I mean, there is RoHS. There have been initiatives, right? The RoHS initiative, the WE initiative in Europe to recycle, that have happened, but that was some time ago. In terms of, anything newer, I would say not enough is happening fast enough relative to where we stand with the environment right now. So yeah, I believe there should be more in that area
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that is that I think the one place where I've seen some movement is a lot of contract manufacturers are going to solar power for their factories. And so there is a tendency to do that. And if you talk to CMs, they're very proud to let you know, that's what they're doing. And, that's the one initiative that they seem to be following up on.
A question on containers. Since containers are often reused, aren't they at some level more ecological or more green?
Yeah, but I think the answer is yes. But if they're stuck on boats and can't get off, you can't. There's not enough of them to recycle back through.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is some effort that I've read about trying to make container ships, run on batteries, which I don't think is at scale yet. But there definitely are. There's a lot of research going into that right now. Maybe combining sails, some high-tech sails, along with battery power to reduce the amount of bunker fuel that gets used in those things. But that's a little bit longer. I don't see that immediately. I think that's long term that we'll see that coming online.
Okay. We have a question from Luke that quotes an article by Scott Adams about is China safe for business? And I guess that's a question is do you see other stability issues there, or those concerns that you're seeing from your customers?
Yeah, I'll answer it the way a consultant answers. It depends. So there definitely are reputable manufacturers in China that that can be quite safe to work with, at least my understanding. And then when you get to the tier 2, tier 3, I think that really does can substantially increase the risk there. You got to be careful. But and I'll let Sharish and Alan give their perspective.
I think you're right in what you're saying, Mike. I think, though, having said that, I think China is getting much more strict. I mean, the government is getting much more strict about business practices because they want to compete and they want to have a good reputation and a good name in the industry. So they are cracking down internally on IP issues, on other infringement issues, and so on. So they are actually turning the heat on themselves in order to get beyond this. Are we there yet? That's hard to say. That's hard to say.
Yeah, but I think the geopolitics is probably gonna trump. Yeah, but Ellen, any thoughts that you want to add there?
No, I think you both hit on the key points, and I think it really comes down to is that if you're going to pick up a supply chain partner, vet them and choose wisely.
Yep, correct.
Yeah.
I think that the thought I definitely want to seed people with is there are plenty more options other than China that are opening up and have been open for some time. It's a question of really exploring what options are available besides China. I mean, China is not the only game in town. I mean,
Well, also China is a lot more expensive than it was 5-10 years
Yeah.
ago. I mean, China is not the low cost area it used to be. Yeah.
correct.
Well, I think we've got the questions from the audience pretty well addressed. I want to thank the panel and just ask if you have any final remarks or statements you'd like to make.
I want to thank you for the time. It really, really enjoyed being here. So thank you, Sean and Teresa, for putting on the event here, and also thank the audience. I thought there were some really, really great questions that were put out there. I definitely learned some things. I always like learning as much from the audience as I share. So thank you for that. And saw several names that I recognize. So say hello to the people that I've worked with in past lives or met in networking events. Sharish and Alan, yeah.
No, yeah, this has been enjoyable. I certainly recognize a few names in the audience for sure.
Yeah, and feel free to follow up after as well if you have any, if you want to do a deeper dive into PLM systems. I mean, I spent 3 or 4 years actually reselling those systems, so I'm quite familiar with, business systems, data management systems.
Okay, well, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, audience. I think we're going to break here then.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nice to see everyone. All right.